All right. Hello. Welcome to our lunch study break. Today is Wednesday, December 22nd, 2021. And I wanted to take the opportunity to teach one of my favorite teachings. I really adore so much about this teaching. The only question I have is, am I going to be able to get all of the teaching in an hour? So I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that or not, but I'm going to try. And what I've wanted to do here, so for those of you who are here for the first time, Marty, hi, how are you, Marty? Good to see you. Luna, it's good to see you. So what we'd like to do here is really dig into theological issues. We ask challenging questions. We can disagree with each other from time to time. That's fine too, as long as we maintain our sense of politeness. So that's really my only requirement. And one of the things, there's a teaching that I love, but I'm always nervous to teach it. I feel I can adopt from Buddhist traditions, from Muslim traditions. I can adopt from Zoroastrian traditions. I can adopt from scientific traditions, from psychoanalytic traditions. There's one tradition that I feel is the one that I can't really utilize, which is the Christian tradition. Sort of hard sometimes. And so with December 25th coming up in a few days, what I wanted to do, because we've really established this place where we can have dialogue, we can disagree, and we can get into some beautiful things and some issues that have some nuance to it, I thought I would take up the story of the Good Samaritan, which I think is, at its heart, has a beautiful Jewish lesson. And it is taught, what I'm going to do is use it, the teaching, the lesson of Amy Jill Levine. So if you're not familiar with Professor Amy, Marty knows Amy Jill Levine. If you're not familiar with Amy Jill Levine, go Google her, look her up. She is, I had the privilege of hearing her speak once at the Bible Institute on this book, which is called The Short Stories of Jesus. And it's just magnificent. And she approaches these Gospels from the perspective of a first century Jew. So how can we understand what this guy Jesus was trying to tell the other Jews in his community? How can we get at his reinterpretation of the Torah in a way that can lend meaning to our current world and, God willing, avoid a lot of perhaps the negative interpretations that have come up through the years because of anti-Semitism and for whatever reason that have, or because of lazy theology, perhaps, that have led to a misunderstanding of this story. Okay, so let me go into it. I'm going to read the story, and then I'm going to pause because I'm curious to know what you think it means. And then we're going to head into Professor Levine's just wonderful explication of it, where she tries to brush away 2,000 years of homiletics to get down to the source material that Jesus was using in his story. All right. And she has a wonderful book called The Jewish Annotated New Testament, which I recommend if you ever wanted to read the New Testament. She annotates it with Jewish sources so that we can understand the way in which Jesus is manipulating the text in order to create new drashot, as we might call them today. All right. So let me open up our text. I'm going to use the text that Rabbi, I just called Amy Jill Levine a rabbi. She might as well be. Here is her text. I'll try to make it a little bit bigger. You know what else I'll do? I'm going to put the entire chapter into the chat so that everybody can look at it at their own level or speed. Here it is. You'll just have to put up with my highlights. All right, so it's now going through. It'll be there in a second. And there it is. Okay, so let's begin here with the story of the Good Samaritan as is found in the book of Luke. All right, I'll read it and then we'll discuss what we think it means. and the lesson that the parable is seeking to teach. Okay, so, and look, some lawyer stood up testing Jesus. He says, "Teacher, by doing what eternal life will I inherit?" And he said to him, "In the law, what is written? How do you read?" And answering, he said, this is the lawyer speaking, "You will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, intention, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "Rightly you answered, this do, and you will live." But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Replying, Jesus said, "Some person was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who, stripping him, even placed blows going away, leaving him half dead. And by coincidence, some priest was going down that road, and seeing him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise, a Levite coming to the place, even seeing, passed by on the other side. But some Samaritan traveling came near him, and seeing, had compassion. And coming toward him, he bound up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And having set him upon his own animal, he brought him to an inn and cared for him. And upon the next day, taking out, he gave 2 denarii to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him, and whatever you might spend, I upon my return will give back to you." Which of these 3 a neighbor, does it seem to you, was to the one who fell among the robbers? And the lawyer said, "The one doing mercy for him." And said to him, Jesus, "Go and you do likewise." Okay, I'm guessing that probably all of us have heard this story. Anybody not heard this story before? Is this new to anybody? Okay, so everyone is familiar with this. So just trying to read it now. What is it? What's the lesson here? What's going on here? Steve, what is Jesus teaching? Go ahead, Steve.
Okay. To me, Rabbi, it sort of takes one of the central features of the Torah and stands it on its head, because so much of the Torah has to do with kinship and the centrality of the Jewish community versus the outside. And what this is saying is that your neighbor that you should love isn't necessarily another Jew, but someone who treats you better than maybe you get treated otherwise. And
I think I understand what you're saying.
Let me just finish my thought. What I can see this doing at that time is it's sort of saying to Jews, you're not necessarily, your loyalty isn't necessarily to other Jews. It can be to non-Jews who you have better connection to. And I can see this as sort of like a bomb in the Jewish community, separating them from the priests and the Levites, and now making them exposed to non-Jewish people. You see where?
I see. No, I see what you're saying there. This was Steve's formation of this is that this can be read as Jesus asking the Jewish community to consider, who is your neighbor? Is it the one who goes to shul with you, or is it the one who will take care of you and will treat you nice? And why is one more a part of your community than another? Why should you have natural kinship towards the fellow Jew instead of towards this nice Samaritan? Okay, thank you, Steve. That's good. Other just first impressions. What's the lesson, Susan?
It just feels like it's more in sync with wisdom as opposed to the more parochial. I mean, throughout throughout the Bible, there are, I mean, Job isn't a Jew, right? Uh, Ecclesiastes, the Jonah, the stories that are wisdom oriented. It seems like Jesus in this case is more wisdom oriented than Ezra type, of us and them. So it, to me, brings out the best of what's in Torah. I mean, that's my first impression.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll let you, that was perfectly said. I don't think I can explain that any better. Other thoughts? Other thoughts? Just in first impression, Stuart. Yeah.
Yeah, my impression is rather personal. I think it has to do with a repudiation of apathy, people going by and ignoring someone in need, and we see that in everyday life. And I've had a good deal of personal experience with that. When I was a teenager, starting with my dad, we on a couple of occasions came upon people who were in distress, and people were just walking by them and didn't care, and probably because they were afraid or didn't want to get involved. And in one instance, we carried a guy who was an old, rather large old man who was having a stroke. People were ignoring him in my building. He was in the lobby, and no one paid any attention to him. We picked him up and brought him to his apartment. And his wife continued to thank my father for years after that. There have been a number of incidents in my life after that where I remembered that and didn't walk by and help someone out.
Yeah, thank you. Beautiful story to share, and a beautiful lesson that each of us should remember. So let's try to, and I think, I almost called her Rabbi again. I think Dr. Levine, she acknowledges that for the most part, this story, can everybody read this text? I hope so. And I've also included the text in that. This story, for the most part, is the Good Samaritan has become synonymous with the charitable do-gooder, she says. And she says the parable of Good Samaritan is so well known for its message of aiding the stranger. You see it used by George W. Bush. I'm going to have to go through this. So I'm not going to go through all of the argument so that I can get through the whole thing. But she sees it used in many other, here's Margaret Thatcher, in other Soviet Union, in other political contexts. Okay. So she says the parable of the Good Samaritan has come to mean whatever we want it to mean. In one respect, this inevitable appropriation is to be appreciated. Texts should always take on new meaning as they are encountered by new readers. However, texts also have their original context. And the various appropriations and interpretations of the parable heard today are generally good news. What's not to like? Exactly what Stuart just said about helping the stranger and being charitable towards others. But those are not the messages a first century Jewish audience would have heard. They didn't need a parable to tell them to care for others. They were already commanded to love both the neighbor and the stranger. Those Jews in antiquity would not be thinking of governmental resources or foreign aid. She's quoting the political issues before. The Samaritan would not have reminded them of the secretary or prime minister, nor would they thought of Samaritans as strangers. To the contrary, the Samaritans were all too familiar neighbors, and also the Samaritans were the hated enemies of the Israelites. So she goes on to say that the parable for them would not have been about looking after a fellow human being. And the parable is not finally an answer to the question, who is my neighbor? She's going to argue that it is more provocative than that. And if we simply identify with the Samaritan, as politicians or charitable organizations will do, will miss the deeper implications of the parable as well. Worse, the standard identification that we have today with the Samaritan leads to the standard anti-Jewish interpretations that have infected much of the New Testament study. So she goes on to say that in many Christian contexts, the Samaritan comes to represent the Christian who has learned to care for others or to break free of prejudice, whereas the priest and the Levite represent Judaism, understood to be xenophobic, promoting ritual purity over compassion, proclaiming self-interest over love of neighbor, and otherwise being something that needs to be rejected. To get an initial hint of the distance between the mindset of the parable's original audience and our own 21st century perspectives, she says wonderfully, to reflect upon the term Good Samaritan. She said, I'm not aware of anyone being a good Catholic or good Baptist hospitals. There are no good Catholic hospitals. There are no good Baptist hospitals. There's no, you wouldn't call something the good Episcopalian or the good Mexican or the good Arab. So to label the Samaritan, any Samaritan, a good Samaritan would be seen probably as offensive, right? If I said to you, oh, you're a good Jew, oh, or you're a good whatever ethnicity you happen to be from. She says here, it is tantamount to saying whether he's a good Muslim or she's a good immigrant or he is a decent Jew. So she wants to know what happens when we strip away 2,000 years of usually benevolent and well-intentioned domestication and hear the parable as a first century short story spoken by a Jew to other Jews. Okay, that's the idea. It's only taken me 18 minutes to set that up. But that is the idea. How can we hear it as a Jew? And that is going to mean doing what we always do, Steve and Don and everyone who's used to coming to them. We're going to look at Jewish texts because they're all over this. And I'm going to try to see if we can create enough context to be able to do that. So let me move on here. And I'm going to move, and actually, I tried to teach this last night at the God on Tap in a half an hour after a drink, and it didn't go great. So I prepared a nice little crib sheet for myself. And one of the questions that I have to ask for people here before we move on is, who do you identify with in the story? Anybody? You don't have to answer, but think about that. Who do you identify with in the story? And be aware that Dr. Levine does not want you only to identify with the Samaritan. She says, that is too easy, she says, for us. You're missing the deeper implications. So we're going to figure out what those are as I share. Steve.
Well, to tell you the truth, I think I identify more with the Levite, because as mentioned in what you just read, that person represents the Jew. And the purpose of the Gospels was really to separate their faith from Judaism and to have something that was separate. And so that's, to me, one of the main purposes of this story.
Good. So you identify with the Levite. Absolutely. Are you a Levi?
No.
Okay. Because I've never identified with the Levites. I'm a Yisroel. And that's going to play a big part of this, Steve, as we will see in just a little bit. But let me move ahead a little bit quickly. The lawyer part is not essential for us to understand this, but basically Luke has a certain amount of antipathy towards this lawyer, but that antipathy, Amy Jill Levine wants us to say, is not shared by the Jewish audience, where for the most part, lawyers and figures perhaps would have been positive, right? Especially in relationship to the Torah. Certainly my mother was happy when I became a lawyer. So he has this negative image of a lawyer. And the way that that negative image is depicted is he asks his question not to gain knowledge, but for the purpose of testing. to move quickly. The lawyer is thinking of something to check off his to-do list. Just let me know, Rabbi. What do I need to do? When do I say the bracha? Do I have to give a sacrifice? Do I have to drop off a box of macaroni for a food drive? Put 20 in the collection plate. If he's efficient, he can inherit an eternal life before lunch. Right. So the question, what must I do to inherit eternal life, when asked by someone seeking to test, is basically a trick question. I'm going to skip why it's a trick question, but lots of rabbis will ask interesting Talmudic trick questions to Jesus throughout the Gospels in order to trip him up. That's a normal motif that will happen from time to time. But the question is tricky because it presumes eternal life is a commodity that can be inherited or purchased on the basis of any particular action, rather than a gift that is freely given. All right. I'm going to skip down here to when it comes up again in this story found in Luke 18, where a ruler asks Jesus the same question the lawyer posed, but his attitude is different. The ruler begins, "Good teacher," whereas the lawyer simply said teacher. The ruler has a more respectful address. His question, however, is just as misguided, given that Jesus offers a number of parables that begins with, "There was a rich man who," and then detailed the unfortunate fates of the rich. And given that Jesus states there is none who has left his wife or his house, blah, 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 blah. Okay. That is not what I wanted to share. Okay, so let me just move forward. Basically, okay. This other parable, Jesus is asked by a rich man. And the rich man asks, "What can I do to lead eternal life?" To which he says, Jesus says, "You know the commandments. You should not commit adultery. You should not murder. You should not steal. You should not bear false witness. Honor your mother and father." Okay, so these are quite literally the 10 commandments that we have in our Torah. His point is not that following the commandments earns the ruler a spot in heaven. The ruler is the rich guy. Jews followed Torah not to earn eternal life. This was already part of the covenant. They followed Torah in response to the gracious gift of the covenant that God gave them, because to do so prevented sin, and because to do so showed how love of God and love of neighbor were to be manifested. So the ruler says back, the rich guy says back, "Well, I've kept all of these since my youth." But Jesus says down here famously, "There is still one thing lacking," he says to the rich man. "Sell all that you own and distribute the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." When the rich man hears Jesus' counsel, he became sad, for he was very rich. And like the lawyer in our parable, the ruler's focus on eternal life leads nowhere. A focus on caring for others might be a better path. All right. So there's this idea of, how do I get into heaven? That's the wrong question to ask a rabbi. Okay. I don't have the answer as a rabbi to that question. And that is not where the focus should be. So what Jesus is attempting to do is to move this lawyer or the rich individual off of this idea that eternal life is somehow a commodity that can be acquired, to moving it into, well, something other, a sense of grace, perhaps. All right, I'm going to move on a little bit. And Jesus said to him, "In the law, what is written, and how do you read it?" And I'm pretty sure that's the same exact question I ask you every week here, which is the rabbi says, "Okay, Steve, how do you read this? How do you read that text? How do you read the law?" Right? The guy just says, "And you shall love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind." Well, he's going to say that in a bit. He's going to say, "How do you read the law?" He's going to turn the question back on him. And he gives the opportunity for the lawyer to display his knowledge to the public. Of course, when he says, "How do you read the law?" He's asking him, how do you read Exodus, Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? Jesus would have said Breshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim. Actually, the Torah is not interested. We've discussed this in eternal life. It's much more interested to live in the present. In fact, you'll know that in Devarim, Moses will say, choose life. So Jesus just doesn't say what is written. He wants to know, how do you read the Torah? Because he's a rabbi and he understands everybody reads the Torah in a different way. All right, now here comes his answer. And the man answers him, you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and you will love your neighbor as yourself. Good answer as a Jew? Is that a good answer? How do you read the Torah? What does the Torah stand for? Love God with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. He adds in that intention mind stuff. That's not quite in the Shema. And then love your neighbor as yourself. That's okay. That's how the lawyer reads the Torah. So is the lawyer wrong? Marv?
I think people make the analogy between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So the analogy is the Declaration of Independence is the Torah. Well, the Torah came first. And the
Constitution.
And the Constitution is the halacha. So when I look at the Torah, I look at the first word, sort of the beginning of Abraham arguing with God. You have to do what is just and what is right. And I think everything takes off from that phrase. And of course, when you do what is just and what is right, you probably will achieve what the highest order is, which is peace, shalom. What's the question again?
Tell me what the Torah means on one foot.
It means
that's the question. Jesus asked the lawyer, tell me what the Torah means on one foot. The lawyer says, love your God with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your might, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Sounds a lot like Hillel, right? Lawyer answers.
Too many words. I like the just and right.
He wants it a little bit more pithy. Okay, so let me go back to the text. Dr. Levine says the lawyer's response is a combination of two verses of the Torah known to all practicing Jews then and now. The first part comes from the V'ahavta, you shall love the God with all your heart, your soul, and your might. Luke adds all your mind. And the second verse is love your neighbor as yourself, which is found in Leviticus 19:18. Hold on, let me just back this up a little bit. The lawyer was right to combine them. He wasn't being original in his combination of these texts. And of course, the importance of, he basically is, in quoting those two texts, he's quoting the whole context. He's not just quoting those precise verses, even though Marv wants them to be slightly more pithy. He's quoting the entire chapter, the holiness code of how we Jews go about being holy by citing a verse in Leviticus 19. And he's also basically referencing the entire Shema. So Jesus says to him, rightly, you answered, do this and you will live. Okay. So the point, the lawyer got the right answer. Good for him, says Dr. Levine. However, he did not quite get the right question. So Jesus changes it for him. Whereas the lawyer asked about eternal life, Jesus changes it and says, go live. It's about life. It's about the doing, not about the attaining or the acquiring. But here the lawyer, like any good Jewish lawyer, wanting to justify himself, says to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Okay, who is my neighbor? Good, solid question, says Dr. Levine. On a technical level, on a halachic level, as Steve pointed out, not a bad question. The Hebrew term re'eh is usually translated as neighbor, but there are a few other Translation, sometimes it's translated as friend. Re'eh can also be translated as lover. What else? The context of Leviticus 19 suggests that this neighbor could be a ger, right? So in Leviticus 19, it says you have to take care of the stranger because you were strangers in a strange land. That's essential to the holiness code in Leviticus 19, right? Here, she even quotes it for us. When an alien resides with you, do not oppress that alien. And Ezekiel, she says, will develop that point. All right. Other ways, she wants it to be known clear that ger does not refer to a convert or a proselyte. It could not. That concept didn't exist. So viewing it in that way, you really have to understand the general meaning of neighbor, at least for Hebrew speakers, is a person in intimate or legal relationship. That's exactly where Steve was going to at the top. We have different relationships to different people in our text. We know that that's all throughout our tradition. Not everybody fits into this category. Leviticus is designed as Israel's law code. It's not, we have the Noahide laws, that's for everyone, but this law code is just for Jews specifically. Relations with people inside the community will be different from those people outside the community, just as throughout the world today, citizens of a nation or a state have certain rights and responsibilities that non-citizens do not. So, good question. One needs to know who are neighbors, and so under the same legal system, who are not. So, from a halachic, a Jewish law perspective, a philosophical Talmudic discourse happening in a Beit Midrash, solid question. Is this person my neighbor or not? And do I have a legal responsibility to care for that person? And as Dr. Levine will point out, but in this context, we are told to love our neighbor as ourselves. Well, that is not really a readily applicable legal category. And so according to Leviticus, love has to extend beyond the people in one's group. Leviticus 19 insists on loving the stranger as well. Josephus, who was the first century Jewish historian, says the same. For in our parable, the lawyer's question is again misguided. To ask who is my neighbor is a polite way of asking who is not my neighbor or who does not deserve my love. Do I have to stop and help that guy who's homeless on the side of the street? Is he my neighbor? Whose lack of food or shelter can I ignore? Whom can I hate? The answer Jesus gives is no one. Everyone deserves that love, whether they are Jew or non-Jew. Lisa.
This is making me think of the Talmudic information about when one finds a dead body at a distance from a town. I mean, we're not talking about a neighbor who's dead, but we're even responsible for that dead person.
You jumped the gun on Dr. Levine. You're exactly right. And that's what she wants to make crystal clear, which is that this idea that the Jews have a faith that says you don't owe any responsibility to the guy on the side of the road, that's actually not true. According to Jewish law, we're right down here, the lawyer is responsible for loving those like him and those that are not like him, but who live in proximity to him. And in Jewish thought, one should not mistreat the enemy, but it's only Jesus who will insist on loving your enemy. Okay, that wasn't quite the connection I hoped for, but let's move forward. There's a connection here. He's going to use your exact text in just a moment. She's going to use your exact text. Okay, so replying, Jesus tells now the parable. Let's get into the parable. That was 40 minutes of prelude to get to the parable. Some person was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He fell among robbers who, stripping him, even placed blows, going away, leaving him half dead. Okay, what do we know? Who is this person coming from Jerusalem to Jericho? No identification, no name, no status. It's an everyman. The some man is the everyone, and Jesus's listeners would have no problem identifying with the victim here. because they've probably been a victim of that attack themselves. And they've probably been on that road from Jericho to Jerusalem. Interesting, he notes that, this will come, the guy's coming back from Jerusalem. He's not going up. He's not on his way to make Aliyah he's coming back. So the question of purity will not really apply. But she wants you to know that the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was 18 miles rocky path. It's like going to Bolinas, descended from 25 feet above sea level to Jerusalem. It's treacherous, well-known dangers here, and there are plenty of stories about physical attacks and the danger found on that path. And then she goes into a little bit of homilies in which people have tried to argue that the robbers perhaps aren't bad guys, but she wants you to know that for sure the robbers are no good. And by coincidence, some priest was going down that road, and seeing him, he passed by the other side. And likewise, a Levite coming to that place passed by the other side as well. Just as the fellow in the ditch is re-victimized by being labeled a despised merchant or a bad Jew, so too the priest and the Levite receive their fair share of negative interpretations that go well beyond the justified critique of their failure to act. Again, stereotypes get in the way. So I could spend the next 22 minutes going through the negative ways that this is read, and that would be great. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to move through the negative associations so that we can get to her conclusions. But there are plenty of them there, and they're rich, and I'm going to try to discuss them in a short period of time so I can leave enough for the conclusion. So we have this notion of people perhaps saying that they were sort of the priestly elite, right? This was an elitist. And of course, the term for priest was a Kohen. So we know when he says a priest was walking down the street, it's a Kohen who is walking down the street. But our priest, he wants us to know, is not a high, she wants us to know, it's not a high priest, it's not a chief priest, it's just an ordinary priest, doesn't have any other special characterization. It's just a Kohen. Like when I say in shul, any Kohens are here? That's a Kohen. All right. So there's no priestly eliteness going on here. She wants to disavow of any negative association that has developed around that. Second, and more common, is that the misguided explanation for the priests and the Levites' failure to help is that they are following Jewish law. This goes right back to Lisa's point. From both classroom and pulpit comes the claim that the priest and the Levite pass by the man in the ditch because they're afraid of corpse contamination or violating purity law. Lisa, what you're saying has been interpreted in exactly the opposite of the truth to reflect negatively upon Jews. There's this idea the guy could be dirty. The priest is not supposed to walk into a cemetery, but there's nothing impure about touching a person who's half dead, nor is there any sin involved in burying a corpse. And just as Lisa said, exactly the opposite is required from us as Jews. All right. Then the presence of the Levite makes, she wants to say, the Kohen not as relevant. The distinction between Kohanim and Leviim in observance of the purity laws continues to this day. As we know, Kohanim will remain outside of the cemetery gates unless the funeral is for an immediate relative. Levites, as well as other Jews, will step onto the cemetery grounds. Furthermore, Samaritans were also bound by those laws. The priest, however, is going down from Jerusalem. But so he doesn't need to be in a ritually pure state. And just as Lisa said, the law rather required that both the Levite and the Kohen attend to the fellow in the ditch, whether alive or dead, for one is to love their neighbor and to love the stranger. There's really no argument in Jewish law that would validate not helping the stranger. So if you hear a homily that says Jewish law says don't help the stranger and Jesus is better than Jewish law, that's not true. So the connection of this passage, parable, and the frame is, okay, we're going to skip that part. Burying the dead is one of the highest mitzvot. We discussed that. Arguments that read the parable of uncleanliness or purity are made by modern Christians. They're not made by Jesus or Luke. Neither gives the priest or the Levite an excuse, nor would any excuse be acceptable. Their responsibility doesn't have an excuse. Their responsibility was to save a life, and the priest and the Levite failed in that. Saving a life is so important that Jewish law mandates that it override everything, even the Shabbat. So their responsibility, should that man have died, was to bury the corpse, and they failed there as well. So any negative implications we might have about Leviim or Kohanim are irrelevant because, according to the parable, they're just as guilty as anybody else is because the Jewish law commands that that person helps. And Dr. Levine says the best explanation she's heard for the refusal of the priest and the Levite, why didn't they come to the help of the man? She quotes Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who preached, I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me. It's possible these men were afraid. And so the first question that the Kohen or the Levite asks was, if I stop help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? Dr. King goes on, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? Dr. Levine writes, King then went to Memphis where he was assassinated. There are bandits on the road, she says. But she says if the issue of priestly purity is not at issue here, why have the priest and the Levite? Well, you guys should know that already. It's called the rule of threes, right? Everyone know the rule of threes? If you're giving a speech, you have three people. The ear responds to the rules of three. So what do you do when a parable or a rule of three? The first two are a setup for the third. So for the Good Samaritan, this rule works perfect because in its usual function, the first two figures fail and the third will succeed. Can you think of another parable where the first two figures fail and the third will succeed? How about Three Little Pigs? Right? Three Little Pigs, classic example. Name two and the third comes automatically. So Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Larry, Moe, Curly. Mention a Kohen and a Levite in shul. What comes next, Sandy Edwards? Yisroel. Everybody is expecting Kohen, Levi, Yisroel. However, Jesus is telling a parable. This is where Dr. Levine writes, and parables never go the way one expects. So instead of hearing, okay, a Kohen comes, a Levite comes, now a Yisroel comes, no. The person who stops is a Samaritan. And in modern terms, that would be like going from Larry and Moe to Osama bin Laden. Okay, that is, we have Larry and Moe to Osama bin Laden. It is a person that you are not expecting to be the next in line here. It is upending your expectation where you would think it would be Israel. In fact, it's a Palestinian. The enemy of the Jew is the one who comes and helps. All right. But some Samaritan traveling came near and seeing had compassion, and coming down towards him, he bounds up his wounds. So now we turn to the Good Samaritan. Okay, hold on. The Samaritan's compassion then becomes, for many in today's interpreters, the hook by which the sermon functions. In a number of settings, it serves as a warning against prejudice. For example, the two who walk by are a pastor and a choir director, while the Samaritan is a gay man, an illegal immigrant, a person on parole, or any other victim of bigotry. Right? That's who the Samaritan could be. The point in this reading is that they are really nice, and we sometimes fail in our obligations to help, and that we too should have compassion. So we have so-called Good Samaritan laws, right? You're familiar with these, designed to protect people who aid accident victims. But all of that is news, she'll say, because to understand the parable, as did its original audience, we need to think of Samaritans less as oppressed but benevolent figures and more as the Osama bin Laden, the enemy, and as those who are doing the oppressing. From the perspective of the man in the ditch, Jewish listeners might balk at the idea of receiving Samaritan aid. They might have thought, I'd rather die than take money from a Palestinian. I do not want to acknowledge that awful person's face. I do not want to recognize a murderer who would recognize me. All right, so that hold on. I wanted to pause here. There's a lot of biblical history on who the Samaritans are. It has to do with the division of the kingdom into a northern territory. Samaritan could be short for Shomrim, they're guardians, but pretty much after Bar Kokhba, the history indicates that rabbinic sources started to have anti-Samaritan ideas. There's this whole debate in the Tosefta. Is a Samaritan like a non-Jew, or is they like a Jew because they keep some of the laws, but not all of the laws? All right, so that's moving ahead a little bit. Now I want to find the better intertext. How much time do I have? I left myself 13 minutes. Okay, great. Now we're going to find out. What did you think of all that? A lot of negative stuff there. Raph.
I'm kind of stuck on like, so what? It's a political text. I mean, it's, like you're going to remind us that Jews are imperfect, but actually our laws are not that much worse, and that we don't do the best job of loving our neighbors or enemies. Is it as political as, Christianity or Jesus thought that something was missing from Judaism? There's the other reason that it would make it to a gospel. And I'm just kind of like, okay, so like we have fine texts and laws and norms. So what are you adding?
What's the deal? Right. How is this so provocative? What's going on here? Is that all there is? Raph wants to know. Good. Steve.
Yeah. First of all, the traveler is almost certainly a Jew who's traveling from Jerusalem. And what really bothers me, Rabbi, as I indicated originally, is these first two who ignore him are symbols of the utmost Judaism. They're supposed to be two people who have, if they're a Jew who is going to help this guy, it would be a priest or a Levite, yet they don't. And that's what concerns me about this story.
Is the failure.
The symbolic symbolism of what could be interpreted as the failing of Judaism.
Well, maybe Susan is going to say what I'm going to say, so I'm going to let her say it.
but this story is Judaism. There's no
But that-
Christianity at this point. This is Judaism. It's an internal discussion.
What I'm thinking, though, is the way it can be interpreted, the way it has been interpreted by non-Jews. That's
Yes.
what concerns me.
100%. And that's what Amy Jill Levine is trying as best to scrape that away, to get to the remez and the hint. And where Susan is going with this, and where I'm trying to go with this, is that, well, maybe parts of Judaism have failed. And quite frankly, maybe some of us cross the street and don't help the neighbor. And maybe that's a legitimate critique that we as Jews need to hear. And how do we give that critique to a people? So that's here. And as far as I'm concerned, as a rabbi, that critique is still valid. And what Jesus is attempting to do is wipe away from any of the justifications that might exist. Hold your note, Marv, because I do want to sort of get to where she wants to take us here. So rather than understand the parable as a negative stereotype, we do better to understand it as part of a resurrection of an earlier biblical incident. So along with the accounts of Dinah and Shechem, okay, let's just start. So there's an association with the Samaritans being the people from Shechem. I skipped through that. According to 2 Chronicles, the Samaritans here are identified still as the people of Israel. They captured 200,000 Judean women, sons, and daughters, and they also took much booty to Samaria. All right, so we need to understand a little bit of biblical context, and I don't think a lot of us study a lot of 2 Chronicles. So the prophet named Oded then condemns the Samaritan army, which has just captured these 200,000 Judean women. And the prophet says, because the Lord, the God of your ancestors, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hands, but you have killed them in a rage that has reached up to heaven. Now you intend to subjugate the people of Judah and Jerusalem, male and female slaves. But what have you except sins against the Lord your God? Now hear me. Send back the captives whom you have taken. So this prophet comes out, kind of like Jonah going to Nineveh, saying to them, you've done wrong, send them back. And a number of Samaritan leaders, chastened, agree. And this is what they say. Well, this is what it says. Then those who were mentioned by name got up and took the captives, and with the booty, they clothed all that were naked among them. They clothed them, gave them sandals, provided them with food and drink, and anointed them. And carrying all the feeble among them on donkeys, they brought them to their kindred at Jericho, the city of palm trees. Then they returned to Samaria. So obviously, this is some take here that is connected to the story of the Good Samaritan. Dr. Levine wants us to know that we can break that cycle of violence between hated peoples, the Jews and the Palestinians. For the person in the ditch or the listener who identifies with him, this text can provide a necessary lesson that those who want to kill you may be the only ones who will save you. All right, that's the lesson that he wants to get across here. Moving quickly, the next day he gave him 2 denarii. Okay. Which of these 3 is the neighbor, does it seem to you? After the parable, he comes back to the lawyer. The lawyer says, the one doing mercy for him. And he says, go and you do likewise. So the lawyer asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Jesus reframes the question. As MLK so eloquently revealed in his sermon, asking the right questions is the most important. The issue for Jesus is not the who, but the what. It's not about status or identity or classification, but it's about action. The lawyer is unable to even voice the name Samaritan. He can only say the one doing mercy for him. Can't even put the name of can't even say who did it, the Palestinian. Can't even say that, just says the one doing mercy. The parable spoke about compassion, but the lawyer reads the action as mercy. His rephrasing is apt. Compassion can be felt in the gut. Mercy needs to be enacted with the body. So for the lawyer and for Luke's readers, the Samaritan does what God does. The divine is manifested only through our actions. Therefore, Jesus responds to the lawyer's observation, not with a question and not with an imperative, but with an imperative. Go, he says, and you do likewise. To speak of a loving God and loving neighbor does not require theological precision. This is why I'm teaching this to this class where we've discussed theological precision for the last 18 months. It does not ask for a particular location of worship. It does not speak to a particular book. Loving God and loving neighbor cannot exist in the abstract. They need to be enacted. Dr. Levine says, we don't know what the lawyer did following the parable, nor do we know if the parable was actually spoken. All we know is what we, upon hearing this parable in its narrative frame, will do next. So she says, in today's world, this is one of the few parables that makes an almost perfect translation to today's situation. And she brings us to the West Bank and to Israel and the Matzav going on there. So the parable of the good Hamas member, she said it could be called, might be difficult for people in support of Israel's existence. Where Jesus is Samaritan, we'd have called the parable the good Jew, and it would be told in the streets of Ramallah. So Amy Jill ends by saying, can we finally agree that it is better to acknowledge the humanity and the potential to do good in the enemy rather than to choose death? Will we be able to care for our enemies who are also our neighbors? Will we be able to bind up their wounds? And can we imagine that they might do the same for us? Can we put into practice this inauguration promise of not leaving the wounded traveler on the road? The biblical text and concern for humanity's future tell us we must. Raf. that an old hand or is that a new hand, Raf? It's an old hand.
It's an old hand, but
Come back in. You're still
still-
unsatisfied.
I don't know. My question is just like, why do we need this? Why do we need commentary on this parable to get the lesson? Like, in some ways, you've said that this is like an internal discussion to the religion, at least at the time. But I feel like surely the Talmud or some other source can get us there in terms of the takeaway. This feels like external commentary, or at least external interpretation on us to then bring us back to what we should take away from it. And I feel like we could skip that step.
Do you think it's valuable? Do you think it's valuable to look at it as Jews? I guess what I'm trying to, yeah.
I think it's just inefficient for me because I have to.
Great.
to,
Stay there. No. That's the word I want. That's the word I want. And you'll be sorry you used it, Raf. That's it. There is no efficiency here. That is the lesson. It's not about categories. It's not about efficiencies. It's not about maximizing the amount of good that we can do in the world. It's not about who am I or who am I not to help. It is about fundamentally that humanity of the individual in front of you. And I have a sermon delivered by someone better than me who explains it. So hold on one second, because it's on your point. It's from one of my favorite thinkers, Ivan Ilyich. And here's how he explains it, because I think it's right on your point that you're making here. And let's see if he answers it in a way that you find satisfactory. All right. Hopefully you can see this.
We're not hearing anything.
Wow, look at this.
There's no sound.
There's no sound?
Mm-mm.
Well, that's unfortunate. Hold on a second. Hold on one second. Thank you for telling me that there's no sound. All right. See if I can pull it back up to where I was.
Samaritan actually felt when he faced a Jew lying in his path.
The gospel says in that story, he felt moved in his belly, his entrails. The Greek word for this is splanchna. That part when you sacrifice an ox to a god, you put aside as impure because there's too much shit in it. The non-noble parts of the sacrifice. Now, the Samaritan felt touched in his innards, which would be probably the most respectful way of saying it in English. He felt this sense of dis-ease in his belly when he looked at that Jew. That beaten up one provoked in him a bodily sense of dis-ease. This dis-ease was a gift from the other. He understood that this guy was in a state of misery. I carefully avoided saying in need of something, through the attribution to myself and to others of needs, what I can give is that need satisfaction. And that really doesn't have to be personal. That doesn't have to come from me. That most probably comes with more effectiveness, efficiency, and competence if we call in the right professional or let the right agency do it. We are therefore in a situation in which the disembodiment of the I-thou relationship has led into a mathematization, an algorithmization, which supposedly is experienced. What I consider during the last couple of years, the main service I still can render is to make people accept that we live in such a world. Face it. Not try to humanize the hospital or the school, but always ask, what can I, at this very moment, in the unique hic et nunc, now and here, in which I am, do to get out of this world of need satisfaction and feel free to hear, to sense, to intuit what the other one wants from me, would be able to imagine, expects with a sense of surprise from me at this moment.
The other, for Illich, is always unique, particular, unrepeatable. He is this Jew, in this ditch, on this road, not an instance of a social problem to be solved or a need to be satisfied. Need, risk, problem are all categories that tend to disembody the relationship between the Samaritan and the Jew. They imply a planned and administered response, not that gracious, free, undue inward stirring which provokes the Samaritan to take his traditional enemy into his arms. During the modern era, Illich believes, Samaritan agencies of various kinds have been the typical response to perceived social needs. But today, Illich says that he senses a growing disillusionment with this type of social outreach, and as its corollary, a resurgence of that free, anarchic spirit in which the original Samaritan acted.
Susan.
I think that's left over.
That's left over.
I thought that was Buber speaking, but Ivan Illich.
No, it's
He
Ivan.
actually has that name. That's amazing.
It's amazing. That's Ivan Ilyich, who was a priest, who was sort of a radical priest in the 60s and the 70s, came to a little bit of well-known acclaim in a couple of books that he wrote called Deschooling a Society and Tools for Conviviality. And what he does there so perfectly, as far as I understand it, is he talks about that what gets in the way are all of these categories and these algorithms and these things that go on that prevent us from hearing and feeling the stirring in our guts. And the parable is trying to teach us that at the heart of the Torah is this beautiful I-thou relationship that we have with another person, in which God's presence is made known by being
It sounds just like
connected to that
Buber.
person.
Yeah.
Well, I think Ilyich is using Buber, and that's why I love Ilyich, because I'm a Buberian. And I think the critique comes from. Well, let me hear what you have to say before I say. Don, I haven't heard from you yet.
Yeah, I really like that guy that you just had on. One of the things I heard, if I heard it right, we don't do it. We let it come through us. So when we see the person on the road.
That's right. Very good.
Do it. That we let through there. And the other thing is that, yes, that's also told in Torah. Jesus says it. I think Muhammad said it. Buddha said it. And I think that it's the same teaching, but we each will hear it from a particular source where it resonates with us. So I'll study Torah, and I get that I'm to be kind and generous with all people, no doubt. When Jesus says it in this story, it hits me in a different way where it makes me actually go out and do more. But that doesn't diminish the Torah.
No,
It
it's just makes it,
more-
it's like being moved by a good poet to go be a good person.
So you can- anybody, yeah.
I asked earlier, who do you identify with? I identify with the guy who's afraid and crosses the street. I mean, especially in COVID, it's very hard to break those barriers. And I think that that's kind of where he's coming from. We've created all these divisions: who's safe, who's in, who can we help, who can't we help, right? Even the hospitals don't even know who to help. What would Jesus say to the hospitals deciding who to triage? I think that is why I'm still trying to tease this message out, Raf, because I think it still has power today. Let me go to Stuart.
Yeah, I'm really, I get a lot of this. I get the other thing with the Levite and the priest, and it could be interpreted in an anti-Jewish way. And I get what Ilyich says about the overcoming your uncomfortableness. The problem I have is with Amy Jill Levine. She's very political. She's very pro-Palestinian. She talks about occupiers, and she uses the most extreme example imaginable, Osama bin Laden, and that's where she kind of loses me, because you can help a bad person, and there's a point of redemption, but at some point there's a point of no return. I mean, would you help someone?
Yeah, I think that's a valid
create a Holocaust.
I think that's a valid critique. I think the better, analogy, might be someone wearing a MAGA hat stops by and helps the person, right? Rabbi walks by, doesn't help. Priest walks by, doesn't help. But a guy with a MAGA hat stops by. That's sort of, I agree. Osama bin Laden is so far over the top. The MAGA hat analogy, I think, is more on point. Steve.
Yes, I think you were getting to something that concerns me a lot, is that we're actually moving away from, you could talk about this in another meeting, but where we're becoming a society of isolated individuals who hide in our homes, who only look at what we choose to look at, who only read what we choose to read. And we would never contact that person who's different than us. We would never even see them or even know they exist. And that's, I'm concerned that that's the kind of society we're headed toward.
Yeah, I'm not a Christian, but I think that there's a lot to that. And there's a lot to this parable that speaks directly to the isolation and to the categories that we are currently setting up. And, I don't want to get political, but you've got, a high-ranking member of the administration telling you to disinvite people to your Christmas party. I don't think Jesus would have you disinvite anybody to a Christmas party. So it's interesting, isn't it? It's just interesting how we've come with who we can care for and who can't we care for. And I think that there's something on the margins there that's hard to look at. And I think that makes us uncomfortable. As Jews, it makes us uncomfortable because we know of the past 1900 years and the way that's been exploded. And as Jews, we understand the need to protect ourselves from enemies. And that's why I cross the street. Susan.
I have to go, but there is an organization called livingroomconversations.org. And now it's on Zoom. They started by actually having in-person conversations, and we've done a couple, not as many as I'd like to, where you really have people on opposite sides of the political spectrum having a decent civil conversation. And that even happens in the Torah study group on Fridays. There are people with very different political points of view, very different religious points of view. And this is the best practice we can do, having these
Amen.
conversations.
And that's why we don't answer them. I mean, Susan, so Susan's a rabbi, for those of you who haven't met Susan yet. And we love having Susan be part of this group because, you know, Susan and I have different theological approaches, but who cares? We're still studying the same Torah, and we still are after the same truth. And that's why I knew it was a little dangerous bringing Jesus in. I knew that. But I wanted to see if we could sort of play with it and take from it a valuable lesson in spite of a lot of negative stuff that has built up around those gospels that makes it very hard to read.
Thank you.
so
This was great.
I want to thank everyone again. I love this group. Thank you for, you know, participating in a conversation where you're not going to agree with everything you hear, where you might not like some stuff, where you might love some stuff, but it is always, God willing, l'shem shamayim. It's always for the sake of heaven. So thank you to all. And
thank you.
I'm not here next 2 weeks. I'm not here the next 2 weeks. So I want to wish everyone a happy secular new year. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Susan. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.